I would start off with a slide up here on the front, two iconic faces that you may recognize. Who's the person on the left? Anybody?
Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs, yeah, nice job. Nice job. And the person on the right, anybody recognize that strange-looking fellow over there on the right? Oh, yeah, great, yeah, it's William Shakespeare. All right, so Steve Jobs and William Shakespeare, two people who you might not have ever thought about in the same sentence before. They lived 400 years apart. They never, communicated with each other directly, obviously, in any way. Most importantly, probably what you're thinking, they are involved in two very different lines of work. Steve Jobs, obviously, inventor, business person, all-around genius technologically. William Shakespeare, obviously a great writer, poet, and creative person in his day, in his own idiom. So two people, obviously they're both connected by their creative work, but really I think as Steve Jobs represents the face of 21st century business, William Shakespeare represents the face of poetry and creative writing in general. And usually we don't think of these two things as having a lot in common. But if we look a little closer at these two characters, we realize different points of comparison that they actually do share in common. Most importantly, probably, is the fact that they are both think of themselves as poets, as visionaries, as people who see beyond the physical reality that they live in and vision future possibilities of other things that could be possible. This is a quotation up on the top from Steve Jobs, and he says that what motivates him in this quotation is something beyond what you see every day. It's the same thing, Steve Jobs says, that causes people to be poets instead of bankers. So Steve Jobs actually identifies himself not primarily as an entrepreneur, as a business person, or even as a technologist, but as a kind of poet. And of course, Shakespeare himself, a poet. One of his most famous characters, Hamlet, says, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy. Meaning that for Shakespeare, like for Steve Jobs, the world was more than what you could see. There was something behind what you could see, and that's what really drives them as thinkers. So another comparison that exists between these two figures is, of course, their business acumen. Steve Jobs, obviously, a very successful business person, ran Apple for many years, and as you can see here on the chart on the left, did wonders for their stock price. Over the course of his tenure, their stock price increased dramatically. What is not as well known is that Shakespeare himself was also a very savvy business person. Of course, he started off as a writer, actor, director in the theater of his time, but because of his initial success in these fields, he was able to invest his money into the Globe and the Blackfriars Theater, the two great theater companies of his day, and he actually retired an extremely wealthy individual for his time and place. So Steve Jobs and William Shakespeare, both entrepreneurs, both business people, and very successful ones at that. But probably even more important than those two connections between them is the fact that rather than just being responsible for one great invention, or rather than simply being responsible for one great idea over the course of their career, Steve Jobs and William Shakespeare both set themselves apart from other poets and other business people in that they envision not just one great idea, but an entire field of possibilities. That for Steve Jobs and for William Shakespeare, their talent was not just in coming up with one great idea, but imagining the world in such a way that all of these brilliant and creative and innovative ideas came out of the world as they saw it. So Steve Jobs, obviously, Apple has all these wonderful products that have come out over the last 30 years that have changed the world and inspired us and made a lot of money for the people at Apple. And likewise, Shakespeare is not known for simply one play or even for one genre of plays, but for a wide variety of plays reaching across every genre, touching every aspect of human reality, as well as his other poems and sonnets and other things that he is responsible for along the way. So in both cases, these are people who didn't just do what they did. They saw the world in a certain way and were able to invent a seemingly infinite number of different possibilities out of this vision of the world. So to me, the important lesson here is that whereas we think of business and the arts as being separated by this kind of Berlin Wall. In fact, we should reconsider our cognitive maps and think about all of these different fields, the sciences, arts and literature, business, politics, religion, and any other endeavor of human activity that you can think of, as all expressions of a similar motivating force, a similar creative activity that is universal to human beings, and that is what is responsible for genius at any level, in any field, in any way. We live in a time of shifting borders. The geography of the world, the maps of the world are changing. The borders that we see around the world are changing. And this is true not only in geopolitics, where you see upheavals across the globe, rewriting borders, but also in the way we think about the world in the 21st century. Borders that had previously existed, for example, between human beings and nature, between our personal lives and our public lives, and between things that are close to home and things that are far away. All of these borders are being rewritten and redeveloped in the 21st century, along with new technologies, new ways of thinking, new ways of being interconnected as a global society. And I think in the spirit of this idea of revising borders and reimagining the way we divide up the world, I would like to suggest that business and the arts should not be considered as two separate domains of activity, but really have an enormous amount to say to one another, if we can just get them talking to one another. For one thing, just to stick specifically with the job of being a writer and the job of being an entrepreneur or a small business person, you can see from these two pictures that actually, in a very literal sense, being a writer is being a small business person. You see here on the right is a picture of a writer selling her book. She's got a bunch of different copies there. As a writer, she's responsible for projecting a certain brand identity, obviously for developing a product, which is her book, and also for selling that product, for being the public face of that product. Of course, a lot of the same things that a small business person or entrepreneur does all the time. And of course, this other graphic represents the fact that anyone in business is also very literally a writer. You write, whether you're writing a business plan or a loan application or or marketing materials for your business, or even if you're just writing emails to clients or to coworkers or whatever, you are a writer, and your success as a small business person, to some extent, is defined by how effective you are at communicating yourself in writing. So again, being a small business person, being a writer, have an enormous amount in common. Of course, you can all think of successful business people who have gone on to become successful writers. Sheryl Sandberg recently wrote a very widely selling book, Lean In, about her experience as the CEO of Facebook. Richard Branson of Virginity wrote a book. The Virgin Group wrote a book called Virginity. Bill Gates has a book of his own. So we all know that, and there's probably many other examples that you can think of. But what is also true is that there are many writers who have gone on to have success as business people. Just a few examples here. Walt Disney, over there, he's started off writing cartoons and eventually built the Disney empire that we know today, and that has had such a profound effect on media in the 20th century. This is Sean Combs here in the middle. Obviously started off as a writer of songs, but eventually used his success as a writer of songs to build up a giant, very lucrative series of enterprises for himself. And of course, as we already mentioned, William Shakespeare started off as a writer and retired with all the money that he made as a business person. So the question that I want to address in this presentation, for the remainder of this presentation, is this question: what can writers and business people learn from each other? If they actually started to communicate across the barriers, various cultural barriers that divide them, what might they be able to learn from one another, and what can we learn from them? And I'd like to basically divide this part of my discussion into 5 points, or 5 suggestions that we as regular people can learn from both businesses, from both writers and entrepreneurs. First one, send a message. This is my first message. So this is a shot from the movie version of 1984, the famous book by George Orwell. 1984, written in 1949, shortly after World War II, looked forward to a terrifying future where giant totalitarian government controls people's lives on in a very harsh and repressive way. George Orwell's book was so successful that not only did he sell many, many copies of his book, but also he actually affected the way people across the globe think about governments and the relationship between governments and individuals in the post-World War II era. The book obviously was adapted into a film, but more importantly, it's actually infiltrated our language. So the concepts like Big Brother are concepts that we use and think about all the time to think about how we relate to businesses. I'm sorry, to governments and the way government relates to its citizens. You may recognize these stills from the famous 1984 Super Bowl advertisement for Apple computers. In this iconic advertisement from 1984, a giant Big Brother-like projection looms over a crowd of faceless people. This very 80s-looking gymnast runs into the room, swings this big hammer up at the screen, smashes the screen, and announces the presence of Apple computers to the world in a very dramatic, powerful way. Now, in this commercial, there's not actually anything about computers. You could watch this commercial and never even really know what Apple does. Its message, though, that it articulates very powerfully, drawing on the iconography of George Orwell's 1984, is this message that Apple computers is here and it's going to change the world in a very fundamental way. This is probably one of the most famous television advertisements of all time, and Apple has been following it up ever since then with a series of innovative ad campaigns that don't specifically refer to Apple's success as a computer company, but refer to a wider message, a more important message about Apple's mission to change the world and to think differently. Of course, there's the Think Different campaign. There's this campaign with the Mac versus PC characters, the iconic iPod ads with those dancing silhouettes. All of these ads, in their own way, articulate this specific message that Apple computers, yeah, we build computers, but the more important thing that we do is we think differently about how the world should work. And so their products are expressions of this message, and that's key to their success. A second strategy that writers and business people can both use and both learn from each other about is the importance of finding a niche and filling that niche in a specific way. So here, this is J.K. Rowling, author of the Harry Potter series. She did this in a brilliant way. She found a niche of people who are interested in reading Harry Potter-like stories, and she identified that niche and she nailed it, and she exploited it, and she went after it wholesale with all guns blazing. And as you can see, she's very successful. There's a line of people outside Borders, Books, and Music waiting to buy the latest copy of the Harry Potter book. She became the richest woman in all of England because she was so successful at what is basically this, an entrepreneurial strategy of finding a niche and exploiting it. And of course, Steve Jobs of Apple Computer can be credited with the same kind of success. He is lasered in very clearly on what people wanted out of their mobile devices. And the iPhone is a perfect expression of nothing but exactly what people wanted out of their iPhone. And so in the same way that people line up to get Harry Potter here, you can see them lining up outside the Apple Store in New York to buy the latest version of the iPhone. Again, brilliant strategy of identifying a niche and turning it into something very successful. Okay, so the third lesson that business people and writers can learn from each other is that creative work is a process, not a product. You probably have never heard of Don Murray, but if you took an English class anytime in the last 40 years, your education has been influenced by Don Murray's philosophy. In 1972, Don Murray wrote a famous article called "Writing is a Process, Not a Product," where he took apart the idea that writing students should simply write an essay, turn it in, and get a grade. For Don Murray, he believed that true writing, real writing, involved not just simply coming up with a product, a finished paper, but actually working through a process of building, of creating a paper, making mistakes, revising, editing, and of course you're probably all familiar with this cycle of the writing process, from drafting to responding to revising to editing to publishing to pre-writing. You've all probably done that a number of times throughout your educational career. It's all because of Don Murray identifying that this idea that writing should not be something that is done, but a process, a verb that you engage in on a regular basis. So you probably don't recognize a lot of these products. These are the less iconic Apple products. These are the failures of the Apple product. Down here, I think this is the Apple III from 1980, huge failure as far as the its sales are concerned. This is the Apple Lisa from slightly later, 1983, an innovative product, but one that fell completely flat in terms of its sales. This thing up at the top here, this strange-looking device, is the Macintosh TV. Which you've probably never seen because they only made 1,000 of them and then they went out of production because there was no market for it. And this is the G4 Power Cube, which is now a collector's item, but at the time was an enormous flop, a bomb for Apple computers. So wow, Apple computers, what a failure! What a terrible job they've done at creating products. Of course, if Steve Jobs had been discouraged or had felt like throwing in the towel after any of these failures, we wouldn't have the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, these devices that have changed the way we relate to the world. Steve Jobs knew all along that success is not something that happens, it's something that you do on a daily basis, and even failure is part of that process. So I think that's, again, something very important, a very important and empowering message that writers and business people, successful business and writers both know. Take risks, of course, everyone knows that. This is Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan obviously became very successful in the early 60s as a acoustic-based folk singer and attracted an enormous following with his folk-style music. But in 1965, at the Newport Folk Festival, Bob Dylan showed up on stage with, an electric guitar. And according to legend, the folk audience at that concert booed. They booed their icon, Bob Dylan, for betraying his roots and going electric and pulling out the electric guitar. But of course, Bob Dylan's career survived this incident, and because of his synthesis of electric guitar-based rock and roll and folk sounds from his early career, he actually changed the way pop music sounds and made an enormous influence on the music of the late 20th century up to the present day. So here's an example of an innovative, successful risk taker. And I use the Bob Dylan example simply because Steve Jobs also used the Bob Dylan example, and he, in this quotation here, he cites Bob Dylan as a personal role model, specifically because he was an artist who kept risking failure. Even though he had achieved a great amount of success early on in his career, that wasn't enough for him. He kept altering his formula and evolving and changing his methods. And as a result of this, he grew as a creative person, and he was able to innovate new solutions to common problems that might not have been otherwise innovative. And of course, Steve Jobs himself, a risk taker. You see him here at an early age, riding a motorcycle with no helmet. Very risky thing to do. Of course, Steve Jobs also dropped out of college. He dropped acid. He went to India. He did a lot of things that are not the conventional things that a young business person is expected to do. And yet he did them. And because he did them, he became the person he became. And because he became the person he became, he invented the products that he invented and did everything that he did. Of course, Steve Jobs also died. Some people say he died because he refused to accept, at least initially, surgery for his pancreatic cancer. And this pancreatic cancer eventually killed him. He wanted to use alternate therapies, and didn't really work out that well. But that's how it is with risk. sometimes risk is dangerous, that's why it's risk, but without risk, a lot of the rewards that come with risk they don't come. So finally, most important message, I think that should inspire both successful writers and successful business people: dare to dream. Dare to dream. Here on the left there, that's Harriet Beecher Stowe. In 1852, she wrote the great novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which 10 years later, Abraham Lincoln would say that she was responsible for starting the Civil War. Because her ideas, her depiction of slavery, made slavery seem so intolerable and had such an effect on popular public opinion that the nation was driven to the crisis of the Civil War and eventually the freeing of the slaves. So here's an example of where where a writer with a moral vision, a powerful vision, expresses that vision powerfully and actually manages to change the world. In the middle here on the top, that's Upton Sinclair, 1906. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which was a very dramatic expose of the meat packing industry of the turn of the century period, where, suffice to say, the sanitation standards were non-existent, and because of his expose of this situation, legislation went into effect that has made an enormous impact on the way we eat and the way we think about where our food comes from. Down here at the bottom, that's Rachel Carson. She in 1962, she wrote Silent Spring, which is the book that is credited with starting the environmental movement, which of course has been so important in affecting our the way we think about our relationship with nature. And of course, here on the other side, we have Martin Luther King. He says, if you want to change the world, pick up your pen and write. Martin Luther King, obviously, important leader, important speaker, but also a very talented writer as well. So these are all writers who dared to change the world. Now, Steve Jobs, just to complete this comparison, Steve Jobs was actually criticized by some of his employees in sort of a tongue-in-cheek way as having what Apple employees refer to, borrowing a term from Star Trek, as a reality distortion effect, meaning that Steve Jobs would get in front of a group of people and talk about some far-fetched idea, some impossible idea, some idea that was so crazy that there's no way they could ever actually become reality. And yet, because of Steve Jobs' passion and because of his articulate ability to explain his vision, people would leave the room thinking that the impossible was possible. This is Steve Jobs' reality distortion effect. And the irony, though, is that Steve Jobs actually has, through his visionary creativity, distorted reality. He actually has distorted the reality that we live in by inventing these crazy devices that no one would have imagined would be possible 20, 30 years ago. Who would have thought 30 years ago that you would have something in your pocket that could send email and take pictures and do all these things that that you never imagined they could. But Steve Jobs, because of his ability to think beyond what was directly in front of him, was actually able to really distort reality. In the same way that the writers that I mentioned in the previous slide actually had a physical impact on the way that we live. And without those writers and the work that they did, we would be living in a very different and I think a much more impoverished kind of world. So just to recap, writers, business people, they both do their separate things, but they both work in ways that have a great affinity with one another. Both writers and business people work to send a message. They both identify a niche and try to fill it. They both think of creative activity as a process and not a product. They're both committed to taking risks, and they all dare to dream. In fact, that's what they do. They're dreamers. That's the common thread that links all of these visionary people that I've been talking about. And finally, for the last slide here in the presentation, I just want to bring our attention to one more Steve Jobs quotation where he says pretty much the same thing that I've been saying throughout this talk. He quotes Dr. Land from Polaroid, who says, "I want Polaroid to stand at the intersection of art and science." He wants, Dr. Land from Polaroid says that it's possible for art and science to come together to speak to each other and to spur creativity and to create new syntheses and new ways of bringing different ideas together to change the world. He compares himself, not so humbly, to Leonardo da Vinci, to Michelangelo. Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, both known, of course, as visual artists, but also both prolific and talented, you guessed it, writers. This is a page from Da Vinci's famous notebooks. This is some doodles from Michelangelo with some of his poetry. And this is, of course, Steve Jobs with his own notebook. All of these, although they all, they live centuries apart, they all have very different projects and personalities, but what brings them all together is their commitment to these 5 principles. And I think if we, as a society, as students, as citizens and individuals, if we can think of ourselves not as as writers or as business people or as this or as that, but as simply people who do creative work for the purpose of changing the world, we can actually change the world, and we can actually grow ourselves, break down barriers that keep our lives separated and keep things compartmentalized, and really make a huge difference in the way we think about what we do with our lives. So thank you very much.